best thing about the summit. Governor, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here with you, and thank you all for coming out as well. I know it's been a long day for the audience, so thank you all for being here as well. And I want to thank the school for hosting us. Aren't they great to let us be here?
They're amazing, amazing. So you and I have known each other for a long time. I'm originally from Louisiana. So I want to start with some of the really exciting and inspiring things that are happening there. But first, kind of start, which is the way everybody has started today, I'm talking about New Orleans, but the state more generally. There have been so many things have changed since I was a little girl growing up there. But talk about, before we get into the great stories of New Orleans today, talk about what it was like pre-Katrina, before you were governor, but some of the challenges that Louisiana was facing in education.
Absolutely. And first of all, Campbell, I want to thank you for hosting this forum and focusing people's attention on education in particular. You know, look, we can spend the entire time talking about how important it is in terms of boosting children's income, reducing the chances they get pregnant as teenagers, in terms of increasing the chances they'll go to college, in terms of if America wants to improve healthcare outcomes, we want to be a superpower, we want to grow our economy, we have to improve our educational systems. If we want to be an aspirational society, we have to improve our educational systems. If we want to be a self-governing republic, we have to improve our educational systems. It is very, next week will be the 10th anniversary of Hurricanes Katrina and Rita. And I know the president's coming to New Orleans, the national media will be there, there'll be a lot of attention on Louisiana. It is very tempting, it's very easy to look back and say, Hurricanes Katrina and Rita caused all of our problems. And that's not true and it's not fair. As you know, and just to take the public school system as an example, pre-Hurricane Katrina, the AP described New Orleans' public school system as one of the worst in the entire country. And it was so bad. Not only did you have parents that would tell you their children were going to schools where they didn't feel safe, they were going to schools where there weren't just basic supplies in the bathrooms, there wasn't paper and pen in the classrooms, they were going to schools where they didn't feel like they were actually learning. We had horrific stories. There was a valedictorian of one school, 4.0 graduate, who couldn't get an ACT score high enough to actually go to college, and this was the valedictorian. There was so much endemic and systemic corruption. You had the department, you had the federal investigators, you had the FBI, they literally had investigations going on. There were stories about employees being paid that were no longer alive, their families were still getting their paychecks, or people getting paid for work they didn't do. It is hard to overstate how bad the public school system was, and it was also an expensive public school system. We spent more per student in New Orleans. So just to put it in perspective, over 60% of the kids in New Orleans were going to failing schools. Only a little over half were actually graduating from high school when you look at the cohort graduation rate. And you go on and on and on, but the bottom line was you had children trapped in failing schools. If you lived in a wealthy zip code, chances are you could go to a great private school or a good public school, but if you didn't, chances are you were trapped in a failing school.
So Hurricane Katrina happens 10 years ago, and there's a decision to be made, which is, schools are wiped out. And do you go back to the old model, or do you revolutionize education? And I think it's fair to say, because there's no other place in the country like it, like New Orleans today. Talk about what's happened there when the decision was made to revolutionize.
Well, and I think that's exactly right. I would invite everybody to come and learn and see the New Orleans example, because yes, there were some unique challenges there with Hurricane Katrina and Rita, but there are lessons I think that can be applied everywhere across the entire country. Those lessons are not unique to New Orleans. We've applied those lessons statewide, and other cities have come and learned. I want to point out there were three, I think, absolutely critical decision points. So Louisiana already had a recovery school district law on the books before Katrina and Rita. And the idea was that as public schools didn't do well, they would go into a recovery school district, their leadership would be changed, and they'd be turned around. What happened after Katrina was that process was sped up dramatically. So all of the infrastructure was wiped out. And you're right, the state basically had to step in, and the state said, we're going to put all of these schools in the recovery school district. The first critical decision was this, and it wasn't instantaneous. It took a little bit of time, but the first important decision was the state realized we don't have the capacity or the desire to operate every one of these schools. If we just go in and try to micromanage these schools, it's going to be a mess. So instead, they chartered those schools. One of the reasons New Orleans has almost every student, it's not quite every student, it's over 90% of the students are in charter schools, is because of that key decision. And so all kinds of foundations came in. The Gates Foundation, the Broad Foundation, Teach for America came, all kinds of different groups. It became a laboratory for experimentation and innovation. That was the first critical decision. The second, and by the way, part of that decision was also they had to decide what teachers to hire, and they basically said, we're starting from scratch. We're not going to simply hire teachers based on seniority or just hire back the same folks that have been here before. Now, they can come apply for a job, but we're starting from scratch, so these charter schools are going to hire the best and brightest, and some of those were teachers in the system. Some of those were brand new applicants. It was a mix and match. The second critical decision. So in 2008, we started a school choice program, my first year as governor in New Orleans, and we said the dollars should follow the child instead of the child following the dollars. And I'll talk to you a little bit more about what that means, but it really means that every child learns differently. And it really means that choice and competition work. And we can talk more about how that has benefited not only the students whose parents put them in private schools or non-traditional schools, it's also benefited the parents and their children who are in traditional public schools as well. Now, we've expanded that program statewide. And I hope we'll get a chance to talk about course choice and scholarship, tuition organizations, and other policies we have done. But I think the second critical choice was deciding that we were going to introduce choice and competition. And by the time we expanded it statewide, I'm proud to say we had about half the Senate Democrats and about a quarter of the House Democrats that voted for that. It was very contentious. We only got it out of the House by one vote, but we didn't have a vote to spare when we did it in New Orleans. And we can talk about the teachers' unions and the fights we had, but that was, I think, the second critical step. The third critical step, today, New Orleans is a 100% choice city. And what that means is every parent decides where their children go to school. So even if your children goes to the traditional public school in your community, you make a decision. There's a unified application process where every parent applies and decides, and it's ranked by parent preference. Now, I could talk to you all day about why choice and competition work. I want to share with you just a couple of numbers. I remember I told you over 60% of those kids were in failing schools before Katrina. According to Tulane, the Cowan Institute, now it's less than 10%. So in 5 years, we were able to double the percentage of kids doing reading and math on grade level. The graduation rate was a little over 50%. It's now over 70% in the city. And so you've seen a dramatic change. The reason I tell you that, a lot of times people that are opposed to educational change will tell you, look, we're making incremental progress. Just give us more time. Just give us a little bit more time. But the reality is children only grow up once. If we don't give them a great education today, it's too late tomorrow. Education reform is not about the adults in the classroom, it's about the children. Now, other cities and states have come to study the New Orleans model. Because the question you might ask is, all right, what does this mean to us? If we don't have a hurricane, can we have school reform? And the answer is yes. So other states, I know Michigan, Detroit, I know Tennessee, and other states have come and tried it, and they've all adapted it differently. But this recovery school district model has been studied, and school choice works. That's not something that you have to wait. We've done school choice statewide. I do want to say one thing about Hurricane Katrina, because again, the anniversary is next week. We're commemorating 10 years. It's too glib. Some people are tempted to say, well, look, New Orleans and Louisiana, they're better off because of the storms. Maybe the storms are a good thing. That's a ridiculous thing to say. I wouldn't wish that devastation on anybody. The reality is over 1,000 people lost their lives. Almost 2,000, but over 1,000 people lost their lives. Over $100 billion of property damage. So many lives were disrupted, communities and neighborhoods destroyed. The point, I hope everybody hears, it doesn't take a Katrina to cause us to be able to do education reform. In some ways, you have our own education disaster happening today in many communities where children are already trapped in failing schools, and it shouldn't take a hurricane to cause us to take the drastic steps, not incremental steps, but the big steps to change that situation so they can all have a chance to get a great education.
So New Orleans is the only 100% choice place in the country, right?
That's right.
So how do you go back, you mentioned this at the beginning, but go back to the barriers, because in some places it feels like you do need a moment that is the impetus for that kind of dramatic change. How do you do it? How do you get beyond the barriers that are in place?
I think there were three things, and I apologize. Every time I answer a question, my wife says, if she asks me what I want for dinner, I'll say three things. I tend to think in three. I don't know why that is. I'm sure that somebody could figure that out. But I'll tell you, there at least, I apologize, there were three things I think that were, when you look at the barriers and the obstacles that you have to overcome, that we did at least, and I think they can be helpful for others. First, there are going to be powerful forces of the status quo. And so one of the most obnoxious comments I ever heard was from a leader in the teachers union in Louisiana that said when we were fighting for statewide school choice, said that parents don't have a clue when it comes to making choices for their kids. Now I met with a group of moms the next day that said we make choices for our kids every day. We know the needs of our kids better than the bureaucrats in Baton Rouge or DC. So one obstacle is there are a lot of people that benefit from the status quo. And they are going to fight. And they try to recall my speaker. They try to recall me. I had joked that, they used to have so many protests in front of the Capitol. I would tell my children were younger at the time, I would tell them those were parades for Daddy. And that's why they have Daddy's picture on all their posters out there. I mean, you had a couple of districts that told their teachers you could have the day off if you want to go to the Capitol and protest the governor's policies. I mean, it got that bad. So one obstacle, and I don't think it's most of the teachers themselves. I want to be very clear about that. The teachers, in my mind, are the heroes in education. They're on the front lines. And I actually think good policies, and we're talking about school choice right now, but we can talk about educator freedom policies, actually are good for good teachers. And many of them have come to me and said, thank you for changing the system. So we're now rewarded based on student achievement, and we're actually given extra recognition and compensation for doing a good job. We're not just evaluated how long we've been breathing or how long we've been in the classroom. But the first obstacle, where there are going to be folks that are invested in the status quo, and that brings me to the second thing that I think was so important in our state, was we marshaled the forces. This is often an asymmetrical fight. The people that don't want change show up. And they tell the legislators, we are single issue voters, or special interest groups, or donors, or political activists, and if you cross us on this, we are going to remember it forever. And the people that are for school choice or education reform oftentimes are the same people that are at the Capitol fighting for lower taxes, less government, and many other good things. Well, if you're a legislator, if you're a politician, you've got one side telling you this is all I care about. And you've got another side that tells you I've got 10 issues I care about. That's an uneven fight. And I'm very proud that we had business leaders and others that showed up at the Capitol and said, you know what, we're going to make education reform our top priority. When I ran for re-election, we raised quite a few resources. We targeted both Republicans and Democrats that were opposed to school reform, education reform, and school choice, and said, all right, we're going to go and help you if you're for this. We're going to come against you if you're against this. We have 144 legislators. I offered to meet with every single one of them going into my second term, and I said, I will listen to whatever you want to talk about, but before you leave my office, I'm going to ask where you stand on 4 critical bills. And one of those was bringing statewide school choice in Louisiana, 4 education bills. So the second thing I think is important is the folks that are for reform, we have to make this a priority. We have to be as passionate about this as the other side is about protecting the status quo. And the third and final, the most important element in this, it was the parents. It is easy to say no to a politician, to a governor, to a legislator, to even an employer. But when you've got moms, and I will say it tended to be disproportionately moms, showing up at the Capitol and saying, this isn't political for me, this is about my little boy and my little girl. That's incredibly powerful. There is nothing more persuasive than a passionate parent saying, I want my child to have a better future than I had. And for me, this is about whether they get to live the American dream. Now, I do want to applaud, I know one of your co-sponsors here, and I see Betsy and some of the other folks out here were incredibly helpful in Louisiana. I've got to say that. They helped to level the playing field by showing up for that fight. And it wasn't an overnight fight. I mean, I've made it sound like we just did this and magically it happened. This was year after year, and they went and sat down and talked to local leaders and parents. And it's a lot of hard work in the trenches. The good news is I think momentum is building on our side in state after state across party lines.
Could you take the New Orleans model statewide? I mean, can you?
Absolutely, and so what we have done 3 things. So we've doubled the number of charter schools in Louisiana. And so we've got charter schools. We've expanded the way charter schools are approved and funded all across our state in rural communities and urban communities. Secondly, we have done a statewide scholarship program that was started in New Orleans where parents can choose to send their kids to private or parochial or other schools. Third, we have done course choice. And I'm very excited about this, where a child can start their day in a public school and then take courses that are privately offered, and the dollars will go and pay for those courses. We had 20,000 students doing that last year. We'll have over 30,000 students doing that this year. And then finally, we have a scholarship tuition organization program where we do a dollar-for-dollar tax rebate for folks that will donate to groups that will pay for children to go to these scholarships, pay for these scholarships for children to go to private schools. We have 3 organizations doing that this year. We'll have over 1,000 kids. One of the things you see is this rapid double-digit growth in all of these programs. And so we started with small numbers, and every year we have seen the demand grow faster than the supply. One of the exciting things for me this year, and in the last couple of years, we're seeing more and more schools open and more capacity being provided in every part of the state. And some will try to tell you, you can only do this in an urban area, and that's nonsense. We've got successful charter schools in rural areas. We've got school choice in every part of the state. Every child can learn. And the reality is we need to give them the opportunity. Too often we put barriers, and too often we tell them that you have to go to this one-size-fits-all classroom. You think about the way we educate our children, it really is an outdated kind of industrial era framework where it's everybody's going to learn at the same time, at the same pace, in the same classroom. Even if one student may be struggling, another student may be advanced, and it really isn't good for teachers, it isn't good for students. So absolutely, we've been able to do this statewide as well.
Is there one policy that you wanted to get done in Louisiana that you haven't been able to?
Sure. Look, I am proud that we were able to make huge changes in tenure. So, for example, today in Louisiana, you have to be the most effective teacher 5 out of 6 years to earn tenure. If you're ineffective in 1 year, you lose tenure. You're ineffective for 3 years, you lose your teaching certificate. We've done all these choice programs. One of the things I'd like to see is universal choice. And so we've gone very far. Almost just under 300,000 students are eligible for the scholarship and the STO programs I described. I'd like to be that. I'd like those programs to be available to every single student. I mean, the reality is it's the right thing to do, but even for parents that can afford it on their own, why should they pay twice? Why should they pay taxes and then tuition? So I'd love to see it expanded so that was available for everybody. I will say this, if you had to pick one thing to do, because we also gave letter grades to public schools, which I think helped build the momentum for change as well. If you had to pick only one thing, there's no silver bullet in education, but if you had to pick one thing to do, I would emphasize choice and competition. Let the dollars follow the students, because that unleashes so many positive forces. I mean, if you could only pick one thing, if you really felt like, all right, I don't have 5 bills I can pass, I don't have 5 things I can get, I want to do tenure reform, I want to get choice done, and I think you'll see dramatic improvements, and improvements also for the students that stay in the traditional public schools, and that's important. You see an improvement for the kids in the public schools as well as the kids that go to the non-traditional or the private schools, and you save taxpayers millions of dollars.
So let's talk about Common Core.
Sure.
You were a big proponent of Common Core in the early days. I moderated a panel with you and Condoleezza Rice, and we were talking, it was, a couple of years after Common Core had been implemented, and you were still really pushing it. What happened? Why did you change your mind?
Look, I like the concept of what we thought Common Core was going to be. We were told voluntary, locally controlled, high standards. Now, who's against that? I mean, Louisiana, before there was No Child Left Behind, had testing, had accountability, and actually won a lot of awards even before, and this was before I was governor. I'm bragging about folks that came before me. They had done a lot of these things. We didn't need the federal government to come in and tell us how to do this. This is what Common Core has become instead. And I've got 2 main objections to Common Core. The first is philosophically, I've never believed in a federal government role for making curricula or other decisions that should be done at the local and at the state level. And so now you've got the federal government using No Child Left Behind waivers. Over 40 states have waivers, by the way, or funding our own tax dollars to tell states you've got to adopt these Common Core standards or you don't get your own money back or you don't get waivers.
Let me stop you for 1 second there.
Sure.
Because the federal government did that from the very beginning. They incentivized adoption of Common Core with federal dollars, and you still supported it for 2 years after, and you were taking those federal dollars from right to the top.
This was like Obamacare. You had to pass the bill to know what was in it. We didn't know because there was no opportunity for accountability or input. In our state, for example, we believe the Department of Education didn't follow the procurement code. They didn't follow the Administrative Procedures Act. So parents thought they would have a chance to provide input. University experts thought they'd have a chance to provide input. And instead, we now have math experts saying, this is no way to teach math. We've got parents saying we weren't listened to. We've got moms saying they were disrespected when they try to show up and provide input. They weren't listened. And the same thought. Now, remember, we just spent a lot of time talking about how parents are the most important decision makers for their children. If we believe that about school choice, how can we turn around and say, well, we don't want to respect and listen to those same moms when it comes to Common Core and curricula decisions? And so we're actually in federal court right now suing Arnie Duncan, saying he violated federal law and the 10th Amendment to the Constitution when it comes to Common Core. But I've got a second concern. The first is philosophical. And the first is I don't think the federal government should be adopting one-size-fits-all standards. Today it's math and ELA. I just asked this hypothetical question. I'm a conservative Republican. What if President Obama's administration, and I'm not saying they are today, but what if they were proposing American history standards? What kind of American history would we be teaching? It would be about victimhood. It wouldn't be about American exceptionalism. It would be about America's shortcomings and failures from a president who I don't believe believes in American exceptionalism. But secondly, and more practically, we've got 3 young kids at home. My youngest is now 9 years old. He's in the 4th grade. My kids are good at math. I'm proud of them. Look, their mom's a chemical engineer, so maybe they got their math from their mom. That's great. They're good at math. And they do very, very well in school. My little boy was in the 2nd grade a couple of years ago. He brought home, they were doing Common Core math in his school. He got all the answers right. But the way they teach math is not the way that you and I learn. And this is simple math. This isn't complicated. This is 18 plus 4 is 22. This kind of math. You and I would have learned by adding up those numbers in a column and carrying over the digits. And it worked. Today, it is a 6-step process involving circles and rectangles, and 18 plus 4 becomes 20 minus 2. And this is what happened to my little boy. This is what happened to my little boy. He got all the answers right. But when they asked him to show the 6 steps why his answers were right, well, look, he has got the attention span of a gnat. I mean, I love him to death, but he's a little boy. And so what he wrote down for every question was, just because it is. The teacher didn't know what to do with this, so she sent it home. She marked it wrong, sent it home to my wife. And I love this. I know you would never do this to your husband, but this is what my wife does to me. She calls me up and says, you need to talk to your son. You know, it's my son when he does something wrong. And I'll be honest with you, after I talked to him for 5, I couldn't tell him he had done anything wrong. I looked at this and said, this is not an intuitive way to teach math. And Kimball, what I worry about is, my kids are good at math. And if we start frustrating kids and they don't think math is fun and they don't want to learn this, what I worry about, and whether people, I personally don't think the standards are as great as people think they are, as some of these folks in D.C. think they are. Even if you do, if you happen to think this is the best way to teach math, shouldn't you have the ability to go to your local school board, your local school, your local teacher, and say, hey, I agree or I disagree, or I don't think this is the way you should be able to provide that input. You can't do that with Common Core. One of the rules is 85% of the content. We're only allowed to vary 15% of the content. Why do they think they're smarter than us? Why does DC think they know better than us?
But so let me ask you this. This is me asking you as a mom.
Sure.
I have a kid who's going into 2nd grade, and he is pretty good at math. And he's learning Singapore math, which is Common Core aligned math. And he brought his math problems home to me for homework help. And I didn't understand what he was doing either, because that's not how I was taught math. But I had the opposite reaction of you. I was fascinated by how much more thoughtful he was about solving that problem than I would have been when I did rote memorization. And so I talked to his teacher about it, and that teacher said to me, you know, we're trying to teach these kids in a different, more challenging way that's better than the way we taught you math, and are you willing to evolve, even though it scares you a little bit because that's not how you learned? And if we're trying to bring our kids up to the next level as a country, shouldn't we be challenging them and being willing to allow our education system to evolve and get better, even if you don't understand how to do that math problem?
3 things. One, if you want to send your child to a school that teaches Common Core, I'm not saying you shouldn't have the right to do it. I'm saying the federal government shouldn't force it in our classrooms. That's the premise of choice and competition. If you want to send your child to that school, that's fine, but don't make my child go to that school. Secondly,
I think we have some teachers who are in conflict here.
Well, look, a majority of the teachers, the unions actually endorsed Common Core in our state. They surveyed their members. One of the unions, a majority of their teachers were frustrated with it. These are the teachers that have to teach this. Secondly, I don't mind my kids learning advanced math. I don't mind my little girl's in high school, and I sometimes have to read her books ahead of time to learn what she's doing so I can help her with her homework. That's great. But I disagree. I want parents to be able to help their children with their homework. I don't think it's a good thing if parents are saying, I have no idea what they're learning, I can't help them, and I'm disconnected from what they're learning. But third, and this is really, I think, at the root of this, we either think that parents and local communities are smart enough to adopt good standards for their kids and tough standards, or we think this will only happen if people in D.C. force us to do this, because they're smarter than us and they know better than us. I just don't think that's true. I don't think the nation's collective wisdom is in D.C. I worry for our country. I think we're becoming more and more dependent on the government. I think we are going the way of Greece. I think we need to get power out of D.C. I think it's the problem with Obamacare. I think it's the problem with $18 trillion of debt. I think it's the problem with the Common Core. Look, you've got now Republicans running for president proposing new entitlement programs, which I disagree with. I just think we can't afford the government we've got. Why are we doing this? So I don't think all of the wisdom is in D.C. I think that, again, we just had a great conversation about we believe in choice and competition, empowering parents. We either believe in that or we don't. And if we believe in it, let's not be a little bit pregnant. Let's trust those parents all the way.
So what becomes your role if elected president in improving public education nationally then? Would you argue for abolishing the Department of Education?
Well, first of all, look, I think I've cut more state government workers than anybody. We've got 30,000 fewer state bureaucrats than the day I took office, 34% reduction. There's nobody else running that's even cut government. We've cut our budget 26%. I think the federal Department of Education should be doing three things. First of all, what they shouldn't be doing. They spend billions of dollars on teacher quality programs that haven't been proven to actually improve teacher quality. So block grant those programs or get those dollars to the states or just get rid of those programs. They measure inputs, not outputs, and it's a mistake in terms of measuring teacher quality. You look at Title I programs, block grant those dollars to the state or make them portable and divisible, do backpack funding where they follow the student and parents can actually spend those dollars on their children. Right now, those dollars don't always go to the classrooms where the students that they were intended to help are actually educated. You look at why in the world is the federal government, I know we're here to talk about what goes on in the classroom, but why are they telling us what to serve in the cafeterias? I mean, I've got 3 kids in public schools. At one point, they all ate the public school lunches. Last year, it was 1, and we had to pack him a lunch on top of this public school lunch because he was coming home hungry. This year, none of them is eating what's in the cafeteria. So 3 things the federal Department of Education should be doing. True civil rights enforcements, not these bogus political cases. The Department of Justice sued Louisiana against trying to stop school choice, even though over 90% of the kids are from minority families, 100% of the kids are from low-income families, 100% of those families made the choice to send their kids to these schools, and they were coming out of C, D, or F public schools. We won that lawsuit, but I mean true civil rights, not political. Secondly, deregulation. And third, transparency. Beyond that, why is the federal Department of Education coming up with student expulsion policies? Why are they trying to tell local schools about curriculum? There's a lot the federal Department of Education is doing they shouldn't be doing, and I don't believe it's constitutional. There are 3 federal laws that I believe that they are breaking today over Common Core because they are not supposed to be involved in these local decisions. So 3 things I think they should be doing.
So explain the accountability piece to me, because you fought as governor in Louisiana to justify how state tax dollars are spent so that you can be accountable to state taxpayers. So now you're president, our federal tax dollars are going to be block granted to the states. So how do you assure us that our federal tax dollars are being spent appropriately if you're just handing them over?
2 things. One, I think the best accountability, and if you only had one, I'd say the best accountability system, parents. They know their kids better than anybody. They're asymmetrical. They know the needs, and they care more about their children than anybody else. And you either trust them or you don't. And I know there are a lot of elites that don't, and think parents aren't smart enough to know what kind of insurance to buy or to have religious liberty or Second Amendment rights. If you live in New York, you're not smart enough to know not to drink big gulps, 10 times a day. I mean, you either trust parents or you don't. I trust parents. But secondly, look, I do think I think there's a role for the federal Department of Education to benchmark all the different tests that various folks want. I don't think the federal government should be forcing a test onto schools or saying you have to use these tests, but I think benchmarking can be very useful. And in that way, as a parent, I can know when my kids take a test, how they compare to kids in Singapore or in New York or in New Hampshire, in Iowa or anywhere else. We can compare our kids to other states in other countries without every child having to take the same test. And let me say this about testing. I know there are some that are against Common Core, that are against accountability. I'm for accountability. Louisiana had accountability even before there was No Child Left Behind. I'm not for No Child Left Behind. That's all another discussion. I think that gave too much power to the federal government. And by the way, Common Core is not the first or the last time the federal government will try to take over a curricula or local classrooms. There will be another attempt after this one is done. We've got to be vigilant. But when it comes to testing, I think we need to have more flexibility. When you've got a high-performing classroom or school, why not give them more flexibility in how they test, how frequently they test, what they test? There are all kinds of tests out there. There are AP tests, there are ACT tests, there are different tests that private schools use. I think one very useful thing the federal government can do is benchmark. So when we were doing the LEAP and iLeap in Louisiana before Common Core and before all this, before No Child Left Behind, we could map how our students were doing onto NEAP. And even through No Child Left Behind, we could tell, even though it was a Louisiana-based test, we could see how our kids were doing compared to other kids across the country.
Governor Scott Walker told us earlier that it's illegal to name your cabinet secretary, so I can't get you to tell us who you're going to choose for Secretary of Education, but talk to us, as others have, about some of the people who influence your thinking on education issues.
Sure. Look, we've got some great, and I'm glad you asked this, because some of the great unsung heroes in New Orleans, the folks that have really done this work on the ground, some great teachers, and we need to applaud them, and some great parents, and we need to applaud them, because they really wanted what's best for their kids. What has been so amazing to see are these teachers. Some of them are veterans of the old school system. Some of them are new to the city, new to the state. They've gone above and beyond. They give out their phone numbers, their email addresses. They come in on weekends. They're helping kids catch up more than a year's worth of learning in a year's worth of time. So I look at some of these organizations like Teach for America, and they've set up like academies to train principals and new schools. You look at any successful charter school network, whether it's KIPP or the other groups, almost all of them have some presence or are planning to have a presence in Louisiana. There is a group of very entrepreneurial leaders in education, and some of them are teachers in traditional public schools. You find them everywhere, but it is what happened in New Orleans didn't just happen because we passed a law in Baton Rouge or because of something that we hoped would happen. It happened because folks on the ground got it done. Although a lot of folks are coming to New Orleans next week with the national media for the international media as well with the 10-year anniversary, I would encourage them to go talk to some of those teachers, go talk to some of those folks working in those schools, the type of person I would look for. And I don't know if you're looking for a job or not. I don't know if that's why. No, I'm just teasing. I know you've got a very good job. The type of person I would look for, here's a mistake Republicans often make when they assemble their cabinets. They appoint people that have very impressive resumes. And it looks great, or maybe they look for political balance for different parts of the country or whatever. And then those people go to those agencies, they become captive by the bureaucracy. They decide when they're there that their agencies need more money, more power, because they go native. Instead of remembering they were appointed by a president who believes in limited government, who's there to empower the people and the local and state government. So I'm looking for somebody who understands that all wisdom doesn't reside in Washington, D.C., that understands the way we're going to improve educational performance is going to be to have competition and choice to unleash the states. I'm looking for somebody who has a sense of urgency that says we have tripled, quadrupled federal spending, doubled state spending. We have increased dramatically the number of folks outside of the classroom working in education, and our scores have been flat. And look, this is a very important point. Whether we all agree on every policy issue or not, I hope we all agree that in America we need to be number one in the world. And we're not close to being number one in the world. And we've got to have somebody who has got a sense of urgency and says that we can't be complacent. You can't be 16th or 18th, and depending on what measures you look at, and be a superpower. You can't have the strongest military. You can't maintain national security. You can't have better healthcare outcomes. You can't grow your economy unless we improve education. And so I want somebody who's committed to limited government, but who also has a sense of urgency, and most importantly, remembers that it's about the boys and girls in the classrooms. You may make a lot of people upset along the way, the adults that like the status quo, but if we all remember it's about those little boys and girls that simply want a great education. Look, I'm sitting here, my dad's 1 of 9. He was the only one in his family that got past the 5th grade. I want you to think about something for just a second. He is a middle child. He's not the oldest, he's not the youngest. My grandparents, they're no longer alive, but they weren't literate. They couldn't possibly know why it was important for him to get an education. Now, they didn't stop him, but it wasn't like this was something that it wasn't the norm in his family. I wouldn't be sitting here today if he hadn't gotten an education. And he had to earn scholarships every step of the way. His parents couldn't afford school. And if it weren't for the great you asked about the teacher that made a difference in my life. Maybe the better answer would have been the teachers that allowed him to go and get an education and taught him, this little boy from a very large and poor family. I believe that every single child out there, I don't care if black, white, Democrat, Republican, I don't care what their background is. I think every mom and dad wants for their little boy and girl what my dad wanted for himself and what he wanted for his kids. I mean, for him, it was all about, I wanted to have a better quality of life than my parents, and I want my kids to have a better quality of life than me. And he knew, he drilled into our heads that the way to get that better quality of life was education. And that's what's great about this country. This is an aspirational country. You don't have to have a famous last name and to do great things in this country. But in today's economy, we'd better be giving those kids a great education. That's why I think it's not just an economic, but a moral imperative. It's not honest to tell a little boy and girl that you can grow up and be whatever you want if we don't give them a chance to get a great education. Chances are, now there are exceptions, but chances are increasingly it's going to be harder and harder to do in today's economy.
You touched on this a little bit in the beginning, and you and I were talking about it earlier, but let's bring it back, just as you said, to the kids in the classroom.
Sure.
We've been talking sort of big policy and system changes. What are some of the things you've done in the state that are just the more hands-on things that you've made that you think have been really meaningful and impactful? And then also talk a little bit about the role of technology as you see it coming into classes.
Two things, I don't think we've finished this fight in Louisiana, but two things when it comes to the day-to-day teacher and student interactions. One, we've got to reduce the amount of paperwork in the classrooms. One of the things you hear from teachers every day is, boy, just let us teach. You know, we spend so much time on the administrative hassles and the paperwork and the forms, and we're testing and we're doing this, but we've got to be able to teach. Secondly, discipline. You know, it is a different world in today's schools than it was when you and I were growing up. And just anecdotally, I told you about my dad. He's a great-grandfather. He was a pretty strict dad. He wasn't that lenient as a dad. When I was a child, you behaved in school, and then you didn't behave, you got home, my mom would spank me, and when my dad would get home, I would be really in trouble. And my dad's idea of justice was, if I told him I didn't do what the teacher said, he said, I'm going to spank you for whatever you got away with, because I know you did something. The teacher was always right. Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am. No, sir. No, ma'am. You never talked back. We begged our teachers, do whatever you want to do to us in school. Don't tell our parents. It was worse. It's not like that today. I can't tell you how many teachers tell me the parents come and yell at them or get mad at them or don't support. Every child's going to learn with an online program. I'm not going to say that every child's going to learn with these customizable, these one-on-one interventions, but to have those tools available, I think is very, very exciting, and it unlocks the potential. If you live in an area where maybe they don't have a certain foreign language or an advanced math class or a specialized training class, you can have access to that. The other thing we're seeing with technology, I mentioned course choice. So in Louisiana, employers can come together and say, we want to teach a course, and they'll get paid for it, and students will earn credit for it. So in high school, we've got kids learning welding, learning how to be, maybe they want to be a P-Tech operator when they grow up, maybe they want to go into healthcare when they grow up, maybe they want to take some advanced college courses. And so now we're seeing students at a younger age being exposed to the technologies they're going to have to use in the workforce. They're more likely to stay in school. Employers are more likely to get the trained workers they need. So I think that can be a win-win as well. One caution on technology. I'm a big believer in technology, and my kids are that generation where they can't believe we actually lived at a time, once upon a time, where they didn't have Google or smartphones or, they don't believe me when I tell them I was my parents' remote control for the TV. They don't understand what that means. One caution about technology, it's not a panacea. There is this danger, this temptation. We're just going to put a computer and a laptop and a notebook and a smartphone on every desk or an iPad or whatever, and that'll fix everything. Inside the classroom, the single most important factor in a child's education is a great teacher, period. And so technology, without the support for the teachers, without the training, if I had to choose, and if you only could pick one, and I'm talking about inside the school, because I know obviously parents are the first educators of their children, but inside the classroom, if I had to choose, and I could have smaller classroom sizes, or I could have the latest technology or the newest, nicest, cleanest buildings, the one thing I would choose is having an effective teacher, a highly effective teacher. I would take a highly effective teacher in a larger classroom. Now, hopefully you can have all those things. I'm not saying it should be either or, but if you have to prioritize, I would choose that highly effective teacher. That is the most important thing you could do inside that classroom to help that child learn.
We got about 5 minutes left, but just talk a little bit about, if you are elected president, given that you want to block grant so much to the states and get a lot of the control back to the local level, what can you do as president to ensure that this issue that you clearly care a lot about stays front and center, and that governors around the country are really devoted to raising standards and getting kids where they need to be?
Well, I'd say two things. One, I think competition works. The great thing about the federal system we've got today is when one state does something well, other states copy it or compete. So as governors, for example, we compete for economic development all the time. So I'm proud of my state. We've got like the 5th lowest state local tax burden. We've done tort reform. We've cut regulations. 70% of the companies that want to invest in or expand in Louisiana tell me one of their top 2 concerns is finding a skilled worker. So it's great that, and I'm thrilled that we've got a low-tax environment, a business-friendly environment. What they're telling us is, and I believe the states and the countries that will compete and do well in the modern economy have the most skilled, productive people. And so I think, one, there's already tremendous pressure on governors and local officials to get this right. And look, economics is not the only reason we educate our kids. The most important reason is so they can think for themselves. They can be critical thinkers. And again, we live in a self-governing republic. Secondly, remember I said it was so important to have the forces for reform that make this a priority. I think one of the things a president can do through the bully pulpit, through highlighting good examples and best practices, is to mobilize our nation on the side of making sure that every child gets a great education. My second inaugural address, I said to the group that was assembled, I said, look, most of you, if you're listening to me in person, chances are pretty good your sons and daughters get a great education. Chances are you send them to a great public school or you can afford to send them to a great private school, and I'm happy for you. But I made the case, and I devoted most of my second inaugural address to the folks there saying one of the most important priorities we had going to that, and I had just gotten reelected with a huge mandate, and I said one of the most important priorities, and where I started my second term, was we've got to make sure that every child in Louisiana has that same opportunity. Imagine how powerful if the President of the United States challenged the employers, challenged the good government groups, and challenged local legislators to say, all right, you need to be fighting for every child in every zip code. I know you've written that not only is this the great civil rights issue of our generation, maybe the most important issue of our generation. I think that's right. And my hope, look, I am a conservative Republican, and I hope to be in the White House, and I hope to see Republicans win, but my hope is that Democrats and Republicans would support this. I'll tell you just real quickly a story about a mom in New Orleans East, because it's easy to get lost in the numbers and facts and figures. We fought for school choice there first. There was a mom whose little girl was going to a parochial school in New Orleans East. She's not Catholic, but she decided she wanted to send her school there. She came to visit with me one day when I was visiting her school, and she was nervous. And I'll tell you her story real quickly. What she told me was that her mom was pregnant as a teenager, gone on welfare, was a single mom, and had her. She herself had done the same thing. Pregnant as a teenager, single mom on welfare. She had tears in her eyes when she was describing her daughter's experience. She said she was working 3 jobs to make sure that her little girl could stay in this parochial school in New Orleans East, and she was there to thank me because the choice program we had done had made it possible for her daughter to afford to go there. Here was the most chilling thing she told me. She said in all of her daughter's years in school, this was the first year she had ever brought home homework. That's how the mom knew that her daughter, she said, look, my daughter's excited about learning. She's thinking about staying in school. I don't want her to make the same mistakes I made. Now this woman, this mom, I know the neighborhood she came from. Chances are, she comes from a neighborhood that votes 99.9% Democrat. I'm pretty sure she didn't vote for me. If she voted for me, it was by mistake. She hit the wrong button because most folks there didn't vote for me. But at the local level, it shouldn't be a partisan issue. At her level, that mom simply wanted what my dad wanted, which was the American dream. She wanted her little girl to do better than she had. She's basically saying, I know what I should have done, and I want my daughter to have that chance. And she didn't care Democrat, Republican. She didn't care teacher union or not. What she cared about was, I want my daughter to get a good education. We need a president that will harness the desires and speak to the ambitions of those moms and dads, but those moms and dads all over America, and say, help is coming. For too long, the establishment has said, just be satisfied with the incremental change. We're Americans. We never say we're number 16th. That's good enough. Can you imagine going to the Olympics and saying we're number 16? Why in the world would we accept that in education? We need to say we're number 1. And by the way, for our great teachers, we need to be paying them more and treating them like the professionals they are. This idea that we're going to undervalue teachers makes no sense. The idea that we treat them all the same makes no sense. The teachers that are making, I told you, every one of us has got a teacher that's changed our lives. We need to recognize them for the heroes they are, while at the same time weeding out the ones that shouldn't be there or improving them. But let's recognize and reward those great teachers that make a difference for all of us.
Governor Bobby Jindal.
Thank y'all very much. Thank y'all.
Good to see you.
And
Great to see you, Bobby.
Governor Bobby Jindal.
if you could give me 2 seconds of each